Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Comics Rot Your Brain, the show where screenwriters talk about comic books that we love, mostly from the 1980s. I'm one of your hosts, I'm Steven Bagatourian.
And I'm your other host, Chris Derrick.
And Chris, today we are talking about When the Wind Blows, Raymond Briggs' graphic novel from 1982, which is a famous account of one ordinary couple's attempt to stand firm in the face of nuclear annihilation. And this is a really, really interesting little visual parable about nuclear war. We follow the story of the very ordinary and frankly kind of dim couple, who are our main characters, Jim and Hilda Blogg, in the days before and after a nuclear attack on Britain. When the Wind Blows is alternately funny, shocking, heartbreaking, and devastating. Few can read this and not be deeply moved, despite writing some of the most beloved and enduring children's books of all time, like The Snowman, Father Christmas, and Fungus the Boogeyman. Raymond Briggs' When the Wind Blows is very much a story for adults. It not only articulates the fears of the generations who grew up in the shadow of the Cold War, it also speaks today of our own fears, living as we do today in 2025, very much still in a nuclear age and a world that has that shadow looming over all of us. This is a comic that I had heard a lot about for many years. I think I actually first bought this quite a while ago, and it's been sitting on my shelf for a decade plus. And I've always been curious to read it. So I'm glad that we finally we decided to tackle this, because it's a very unusual and I think very very powerful but short little collection of comic stories here. It's one story, but it's almost like a comic strip format extended out into 40 or 50 extremely dense little pages.
That's right. And before we get on with the discussion, we just want to say, if you are a fan of this show, please hit like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you know when the next episode is. Also, follow our Patreon at patreon.com/comics rot your brain. Yeah, Steve, I found this book kind of crazy. Now, this book can't. So here's something that's interesting. We've talked a lot about a lot of books are the specter of the Cold War is affecting a lot of work in the early '80s.
Yes.
And this is a great example of someone, like you said, who's a children's author who is now tackling this. Now, here's the part about this was published in 1982. What's interesting as a graphic novel, what's interesting is the special bulletin, the thing that was done by Ed Zwick, and the day after, which was done, like here in the States on TV, those both came out the following year. Like they came out in 1983. So I'm wondering what was like, if those things were somehow influenced by this book, this like When the Wind Blows. And also there's a show in Britain that came out in 1984 called Threads, which deals with the devastating effect of a nuclear war as well. So I'm almost confident that was probably someone said, well, if this graphic novel kid do it, then we need to do this as a show. So,
that makes sense.
It's interesting to see, but see, it makes sense to what we were saying so much about. And we said this a lot on when we did Generation Zero and other stuff. It's like the Cold War was so prevalent in American life, in the world's life at this time, that it just it affected so much art and so much, particularly like stuff that's like the media like this, which I think is which is gone now. And I think that most people, don't even I think most people can't even fathom what it was like for there to be this impending nuclear doom that we were all thought could happen at any time.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, yeah. I think it's really hard to put yourself back in the place of how people felt in the 80s, where so much of the material that we're covering on this show and just so much of the most impactful comic book storytelling in the 80s was really, like you say, sort of shot through with this terror over the impending apocalypse. And, from the really famous books like Watchmen to some of the stuff we've covered that's more obscure on our show, like Generation Zero, as you said, or even Saber and the post apocalyptic sort of feeling of that book. I mean, yeah, the nuclear shadow loomed very large. And I'm looking here at where Raymond Briggs himself drew.
Wait, before
What's
you
that?
get that, I just
Yeah.
say one thing. See, and also, here's what people don't quite get it all anymore
Hmm.
is that those early, so Spider-Man and Iron Man and the X-Men were all sort of like these books that came out of the nuclear age.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the Incredible Hulk, too,
Yeah, the Hulk, yeah, Hulk too.
like
Yeah,
his whole
yeah,
origin story, right? Yeah.
yeah. His origin, Spider-Man with the dealing with the radioactive thing, the X-Men are the children of the atom. So it was
Yep.
this whole thing that was like, because if you think about, Stan Lee, he started it's Jack Kirby started work in the 50s. I mean, in the 40s, like during
Yep.
the war. So those heroes, like those DC heroes, like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, everyone like that, and Green Lantern, like they were created before there was nuclear like weapons. And then
Right.
and the Marvel heroes are basically stemmed from nuclear weapons. And now we get to Raymond's story.
Yeah,
This
yeah, yeah. That's a great point. I'm glad you actually said that, because that's a really great point. How that nuclear kind of influence loomed so large over pop culture and over all comics, including, yes, like you say, the Marvel heroes. And it's kind of fascinating to see how everyone was processing this differently. Specifically, Raymond Briggs, his inspiration, it looks like, for this story came from him watching a panorama documentary on nuclear contingency planning, and the dense format of the pages that he decided to use for this comic itself was inspired by a Swiss publisher's miniature version of his previous children's comic Father Christmas. And so that kind of was what inspired him in terms of subject matter and format. And I think we should say that this story, when it came out, this comic was so impactful, made such a huge impact, that it was then adapted into a two-handed radio play as well as an animated film. And so this story, When the Wind Blows, made quite a huge impact. And as we can see from the reviews on the cover of the edition that I have here from Penguin in my hand, uh, the quote on the front cover from the Sunday Times says, "It's a visual parable against nuclear war, all the more chilling for being in the form of a strip cartoon." And The Guardian goes on to say, "This comic is aching with love and bitterness, and it is meant to break your heart." And I think that's fair. I think that's an accurate description of what this story is intended to do, and actually does quite well. And I'm curious, Chris, for you reading this, what kind of emotional reaction did you have reading this? Because I feel like I had a few different stages of how I was feeling at different points in this admittedly short, but also rather dense piece of storytelling. I'm curious, like, what was your, before we dive into the specifics of it, I'm just curious what your emotional reaction was going through the various parts of the story.
um It's a really interesting question, and it's. I'll say this, and this is just where I am in my life about this. It's like it was very, it was angering, and it was depressing, and it was also very frustrating for me, and and not because of the story per se, but those are the feelings that welled up like in me,
Yeah,
because you have this story about this couple. It's what is this is like it's 82, but maybe he's writing in 80.
right.
So you're 35 years like removed from the end of World War II, and which is and that's even farther away like than now when this book was published,
Sure.
and which is crazy if you think about it, right? So, but it's like you have this couple, and they live their life, and they're like together, and they have this kind of like way of behaving and acting the way that the old married couples do, and it was like I was just at, Chicago to visit my parents for the holidays, and there's like that kind of there's that you see this all the time, or the way people depict these old married couples, but there's a version that is cliched, and there's stuff that's stereotyped, and there's probably some things that work all the time, but it just made me think about some of the kind of like things that my parents are concerned with, that like are not really, you shouldn't spend time being concerned with, you know
Right, right.
and there's so that's some of the frustration in reading it. I was like depressed because I'm like, oh, but like here's a couple that's together, and they know each other very well, and it's like it just makes me think of my own life, and it's like, like I'm not in a relationship right now, and I think about it a lot, and I'm just like, man, like there's moments that are in here that are so touching when they're talking about their son, and they're talking about, like their like these kind of thoughts about their own kind of like this stifled like kind of romance that
Yeah,
they have, that I mean that it was moments like that that felt so like, oh my god, like, and they are misrepresenting, sorry, they're misprocessing what it means for the world to end. And here's
yeah,
the thing, I'm saying this now, I'm saying this like it's a Monday, and the previous Friday was when this whole thing with Trump and Vance and Zelensky like went off
yeah,
the rails, and we've seen
yeah,
like the world of the past 80 years like sort of get crumbled and thrown into the dirt, and it makes you think about what is happening now for us. Like our future is so uncertain because everything that we kind of could rely on on like on a larger scale in terms of what this book is talking about in terms of like the geopolitics is now out the window. And there's an interesting thing they talk about in the book where they talk about MAD, which means mutually assured destruction. I remember
right.
when I first heard that term, I think I was like in second grade or something like that, and I thought it was like, that is crazy. But it kind of reminds me of, sort of my favorite moment in my probably second favorite James Bond movie, which is um For Your Eyes Only. And at the end of that movie, there's a moment where Bond has this little device that they were chasing after, and this Russian guy comes out, and they're in like Greece or something like that, and he like takes the thing they've been fighting for the whole time, and he throws it off the cliff. And the guy says, the Russian guy and the Russian guy looks at Bond like, you're crazy, and Bond's like, I don't have it, and you don't have it, and the Russian guy just says detente, and just and does this about face and walks back in his helicopter and gets in the thing and flies away, and you're like, oh, as a kid I was kind of like, what the hell does this word detente mean? Like, what does that mean? And and it falls into the thing with mutually assured destruction. It's like the Soviets and the Americans were right at each other's throat to the point, but they knew that no one was going to make the first move. And that's like a level of like, there's some reassurance in that, like no one's
Yeah,
going to do that. And, but but I feel that's sort of like off the table now with our own situation. So when I'm reading it, I'm just like, it's this sense of like, of like remorse and depression, and like I laugh at it from time to time because there's funny stuff in here, but
sure.
but I could see if I was reading this as like 30s or 40s or 50s back in the 80s when this came out, I'd be a little stunned by it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, well, I think it is really stunning, and yeah, that's interesting. I think that's a good answer in terms of your kind of mix of feelings, because it is pretty stunning to see this really casual sort of idyllic relationship between this couple in the English countryside, juxtaposed against, you know, nuclear annihilation and the bomb dropping, and them trying to protect themselves in the ways that they're told to protect themselves in these ridiculous government pamphlets. And it's like they have to, like, hang sheets in the windows and, like, build like a protective little shelter for themselves using like wood and iron and whatever. And it's so absurd, but you're also kind of struck by the total helplessness of this couple, and you almost have to ask yourself, are they really kind of slow in the way they're processing all this, or are they just completely in mutual denial because they don't want to accept the horror that is actually transpiring and what's happening to them? Because it's really just about this nice couple living a perfectly mundane life by themselves in the isolated countryside, and all of a sudden the bomb drops. The Russians drop a nuclear bomb, and they very slowly begin to die, and they very slowly begin to die from the nuclear radiation, and it's horrific to watch it.
Well,
But
there's that,
neither
and there's no water.
there's no water, but they're in constant denial over the reasons
The
why.
reasons
You know,
why. Well,
yeah,
we'll see. So this is why I wanted to bring up in the beginning, like those three TV shows,
yeah,
because I remember, like, when I was in elementary school, we saw one or two of those, you know, black and white from the 50s, kind of like, here's what you do in terms of the nuclear attack kind of shelter things,
hmm,
and they would, like, I get under your desk and blah, 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 but that's all before these movies came out. And the only movie that I remember, now, I wasn't old enough to see this movie when it came out, but I saw it older, and I know this movie is very poignant. It's called Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and it
hmm,
came out in the mid '60s, and it's about this woman named Emmanuelle Riva, who was in Japan, and she's having a love affair with a Japanese man, but she's there trying to understand the, sort of like, he's in love with her, but he's distant in a way, because they're trying to process what happened with the war. It's
right,
in the '60s, early '60s, maybe late '50s, but it's like, but there's already, like, memorials for Hiroshima. And
hmm,
but and it's like, but we're seeing it in black and white, and we're seeing the aftermath of it, and we're not seeing what really happened to Tokyo. I mean, sorry, not Tokyo, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because there was no cameras there on the ground. And so when we see this day after special bulletin threads, that's the first color version of what a nuclear war is going to do
yeah,
to people. Because obviously you have a movie like, what's the movie, the Cheston thing, the apes, Planet of the Apes. It's like,
right,
it's after the war, and the whole thing, and you realize that when he sees the Statue of Liberty thing, and it's like, oh, but you don't see the day, I guess the movie, the day after, the week after effects of what this is gonna do. Like, there's a great thing in the book where the dad, the father, he's talking about, well, we gotta watch out for the fallout. We didn't put the fallout, and keeps coming up after the bomb goes off, and it's like, he doesn't know what that is. He doesn't
yeah,
know that there's just it's gonna be in the air. Like, the radiation is gonna be there in a way that it's gonna affect you in a way that you can't comprehend. I think there's a great line. I don't remember if it's in the movie, or I'm sorry, the TV, in Chernobyl. Either Craig
hmm,
Mason says it in an interview, or maybe Jared Harris says it in the, um
like the making of.
no, Jared is an actor. He says it
Oh,
to
wow.
he's giving a thing to the Politburo, and he says something to the effect that, like, look, if you think about a nuclear bomb, the radiation is atoms. They're like bullets going through your body that fast. They're
Hmm,
hitting you that, you don't see them, but they're hitting you and causing that kind of damage at the atomic level. And I
hmm,
was like, that's a really, really interesting way to, um, describe that, because
hmm,
again, in Chernobyl, that show, there's a really, really great scene, the way the first episode ends, where there's all this the people from the city of where Chernobyl is, they've come out to watch what's happening from afar, all these families and stuff like that, and you see this ash fall down on them. And and us now watching it, and was at 2016, we're like, oh, they're all fucked,
Yeah, right.
because we know what that fallout is from the game, from these movies, and it's like, but those people didn't know, and because I'm assuming that these three television shows that we mentioned did not play on Soviet TV because of the
Yeah,
there was no way to do that.
I
It
would
was not,
imagine. I
it
would
was not
imagine they
shown.
did. Yeah.
So it's like there's a, and that's also different too, because that was like, what's falling on them is pieces of atom is stuff from that plant that's been made radioactive and shot in the sky. So it's pieces of like the roof and shit like that. It's not just so. But back to the comic, it's like they're just caught in the blast wave, so they're not gonna be, so the fallout. They're never gonna really see anything. It's kind of it's interesting that that happens, that they're so not aware of what happens, because I don't think that the public really knew, and
Yeah.
they don't know.
Yeah. And if they did know, they would be horrified. And then, even also, if they did know, there's a certain feeling of complete helplessness, because what are they going to do, really? And, just to illustrate a little bit of how mundane and kind of ordinary the lives of this couple are, I'm just going to read a little bit of the dialogue on the first page or two here. And you see this fellow Jim getting dropped off by some kind of a van or a shuttle in the countryside, or some kind of a little mini bus. And the bus driver says, "Cheerio, Jim." And he says, "Cheerio." And we see him walking up the path to his perfectly lovely English countryside house for four silent panels. Nice, kind of like, portly old, bald British fellow. And he walks into his place and he says, "Hello, dear." And she says, "Hello, love." His perfectly nice wife, a couple of just nice middle-aged, or, maybe slightly elderly couple. "Did you have a nice morning, dear?" "Oh, all right, thanks. Rather uneventful. My life isn't very fast-moving or dynamic." "Well, you are retired, James." "You do seem a bit down, dear." "Yes, well, been reading the newspapers. Been reading the papers in the public library all morning. Oh, those things full of rubbish. I never look at them except the stars. We must keep abreast of the international situation, ducks." Oh, and that's really cute. He calls his wife
I love that.
ducks. Yeah,
I
it's really
love that.
funny. And it's not singular, it's plural, which is so funny. He calls her ducks. Yeah, it's really sweet. Very, very sweet. Um, the decisions made by the powers that be will get to us in the end. Politics and sport, that's all they're full of. It could affect us all, the ultimate determinant and all that. They say there may be a preemptive strike, dear. Oh, not another strike. It's wicked. I'd have them all locked up. Blessed communists. Oh, it all looks pretty humpty. It's not that sort of strike, duck. Sausages or beef burgers, dear? Sausages, thanks. It looks as if the balloon could go up at any moment. What balloon, dear? Mashed or chips? Chips, thanks. Oh, I don't know. The balloon, or is it a maroon? I can't remember. What are you talking about, James? It looks as if there's going to be a war, dear. Yes, they say it might break out at any time now. Well, at least you won't be called up, James. You're far too old. And, and then they go on, and she says, yeah, she says, "You're far too old." And then he says, "Thank you, my beloved. I'm still 2 years younger than you." Well, if the worst comes to the worst, we'll just have to roll up our sleeves, tighten our belts, and put on our tin hats till it's VE Day again. No, it won't be like that this time, love. I think this one's called the Big Bang Theory. It's all been worked out by brilliant scientists. Well, we survived the last one. We can do it again. It'll take more than a few bombs to get me down. Yes, we must always look on the bright side, ducks. Nice dinner, dear. And then all of a sudden, the radio goes off as they're about to have dinner. And the radio says, "The Prime Minister made a statement this afternoon in view of the deteriorating international situation, warning the country preparations are underway, outbreak of hostilities, fallout shelters, 3 days' time." And the man, he freaks out and he says, "Oh, crumbs. What's the matter, dear? Have you burned yourself? This is it, ducks. This is really it. 3 days, blimey." Another sausage, dear? I shouldn't worry too much. It'll probably all blow over. And he's like, Blimey! And she says, Language, James, language. And so then that's when he goes running to his jacket and he gets the pamphlet that he got at the library. That's the Householder's Guide to Survival, which should be very authoritative, he says, because it's printed by the county council. And then this is what guides them for the rest of the comic as they build their own little makeshift fallout shelter, their spot that they're going to try to be safe in. And then they stay in there while the bomb is dropped, but they're not able to stay in there for too long. And as they come out to see what's become of the world, things get very bleak and very sad in the final
Yeah,
final third of the story. Their bodies literally begin to show
the
the
radiation, the
the
radiation.
radiation poisoning affecting their bodies, and they're starting to literally die, and their bodies are falling apart from the radiation, and it's very sad. And one of the reviews I saw called this a horror story. And I could see why, because there is a certain amount of body horror going on here. Yeah, the quote from the Daily Mirror called this a horror story. And, the New Statesman said it's a funny and frightening book. And I think that's very accurate. It starts off as kind of a bit of a mundane kitchen sink drama that, you could see why it was adapted into a stage play. It's just these two actors, this one location, an increasingly kind of like awful situation that's reflected through their dialogue. But really, the ending, yeah, I mean, the ending absolutely is chilling and horrific, and it's like the worst nightmare for anybody. Nobody wants to die from radiation poisoning, and it's a very very sad, bleak ending.
Yeah, well, see, the thing about the radiation poisoning again, it's like this is 82. Like, I don't think that there was any discussion of that.
Hmm.
Like there's a movie. I can't remember what it's called now. It's a really interesting movie. It has like Gregory Peck in it, and I want to say Fred Astaire, and it's like they are on a submarine, and like a nuclear war goes off and they're underwater, and when they come up in like I want to say Australia or something like that, and it's gone, like the whole world's gone. But it's like, they don't deal with the radiation poisoning. And I think that, and I don't know what everybody knew about what happened in Japan. I knew they dropped a bomb. It was an interesting like thing like in this story when he's like, "Oh, I got to change clothing because I can't wear anything with patterns or colors because they said when the bomb dropped in Japan, those colors like transferred in, burned into
Yes.
the
Yeah.
people,
Right.
and buttons and all or some shit like that." And I was like, "Yeah, they don't." Like every time I read about what happened in Japan, and I've read about that for almost my whole life because I'm interested about it. It's always some things that kind of shock me still. Like sometimes people just their skin would just like fall off, like just, like they would say, just like sheets, it would just fall off in sheets, and it wouldn't happen immediately. It happened like years later,
Whew.
and it's just like what the fuck,
Jesus.
like no one. There's the Japanese, I think, for their own sanity, have sort of um I don't want to say sanitized what happened because they obviously don't have any weapons and Godzilla and also that kind of stuff. But I think that their own personal shame as a nation, because of how, it's part of their one of those things about Japan, that they don't broadcast the horrors the way that that would happen if it happened like in America.
Hmm.
Like the
Hmm.
way that we like just can't let 9/11 go. And
Hmm.
9/11 is a tragedy, but it's nowhere near a tragedy compared to what happened in Tokyo. I mean, in
Hmm.
Nagasaki, Hiroshima. It's just like, all the
Yeah, well,
people.
there's orders of magnitude in terms of the difference, like in
Yeah,
terms of the
exactly.
death toll. Just
Exactly.
objectively speaking, the death toll is very
It's
very
insane,
different.
it's insane, but you know what, like, I don't know if Japan, I've not heard this, if they have like every year, do they have a thing on TV to say, "Here was the day that the Americans dropped a bomb," you know what I'm saying? Like the way they
Right,
do
right.
here.
Yeah, I don't know. That's an
And
interesting
it's
question.
I mean, it's, and honestly, I don't even know if people could tell you what day that those 2 things happened.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, it's like, I
Well,
mean,
certainly Americans could not.
yeah,
But yeah,
Americans, and we should, you
yeah,
know,
absolutely. Yeah, you're
because
right.
at the same time, like, we know about December 7th,
Mm-hmm.
but we
Mm-hmm.
don't know about the day that we ended it. It was like August 3rd, or so, and then like
Yeah,
5 days later, it was like I don't even know,
right.
and it was just crazy.
It is.
Um,
You're right. No, those are really interesting points. That's totally true. And um, by the way, just incidentally, the Gregory Peck movie you were talking about was called On the Beach
yes,
with the nuclear submarine. Also
yes,
featured Ava Gardner,
yes,
Anthony Perkins, and Fred Astaire.
yes,
What a cast!
yeah, yeah. It's one of the few Fred Astaire non-dancing movies. It's like
It's a Fred Astaire nuclear submarine movie.
it's like 1962 or something like that, but it's a really good
Wow.
movie. I remember
Wow. Yeah.
I remember I remember seeing it as a kid, and I was like, I used to watch all
Wow.
these Fred Astaire movies as a kid, him and Ginger Rogers, and it came on American Movie Classics, and I was kinda like, "What is he doing in this fucking
Wow. Yeah,
this
this is
war
crazy. It's a
this war allegory?"
post-apocalyptic movie with Fred Astaire.
Yeah,
Like that's wild.
yeah,
That's actually really crazy.
crazy.
Well, just speaking to the emotional sort of carnage of this story and how affecting it is, um, I will say, I think it was really edifying for me to take a look at this little mini documentary on the BBC that you can find on YouTube, where they show some filming of the stage play adaptation of When the Wind Blows, and they're talking to the cartoonist Raymond Briggs about his process in writing and drawing the book over a matter of time. And he said something really interesting in this mini documentary, Chris. And we'll post a link to this the BBC doc in our description for this episode. But Raymond Briggs talked about how just because of the process of writing and drawing the comic book version of this story, When the Wind Blows, because he spent about 4 months writing it and then 18 months illustrating it, right? So out of the 2 years or so he worked on it, the vast majority of that time, he'd already written the story, and now he was just executing the illustrations. And he said he found the drawing process quite tedious. And just to get through that 18 months, he said he'd had to kind of emotionally disconnect from
Yes,
the story, to a large extent, which is understandable, right? Because you don't want to be in that headspace of nuclear annihilation every day for 2 years. So at a certain point, it's like he's drawing pictures and drawing the same little people over and over and over again. But he said it was kind of a revelation for him when he saw his own stage play, which he also wrote the script for. He said it was a revelation watching the actors, and it looked like the performances, from what I could see in the BBC doc, were exquisite. Like they were terrific,
yeah,
really
yeah,
emotional, highly affecting performances. And he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but he said he suddenly got choked up and he got really emotionally affected again by his own story. And he said he'd kind of forgotten how deeply emotional what he had written actually was when he first wrote it, because that the drawing process had just sort of taken so long for him to get through. And now watching the actors in real life having this experience and the horror and the sadness and the love of it all, yeah, he seemed quite moved by it, which I thought was a fascinating sort of reaction. And I also kind of felt similarly, because in watching the BBC doc, it did make it feel very real to me. And the comic book is really well done, but I think the voices in my head for the characters didn't have quite the emotion that the actors were bringing to that BBC performance. So in a sense, it's a good argument for adaptation, and how sometimes seeing a story in different mediums can be revealing, and sometimes the adaptation into a different medium can really draw out an aspect of a story that may not have been front and center for you in some other medium. But suddenly, with the emotion of the actors, I thought, like, wow, yeah, this story is really, truly devastating. Watching these real people, this real old, frail, old, sweet couple going through this horror, and like hearing the strain in their voices. Yeah, it was quite affecting. So I would like to see the stage play at some point. But
well,
that really shows you how strong the story is, right? That
well,
it translates so well across multiple mediums like this.
but he said he said it was a radio play as well as a stage play, right? Because
Yes, I believe. Yeah, I believe that's true. I'm think if I'm not mistaken, it was both, or perhaps I might be conflating the radio play and the stage play together.
yeah,
And yeah, but either way, it was a play.
because here's the thing that's interesting. There's two things about there's a couple things interesting about this that I think about a lot now. Again, because of like Trump is trying to destroy the PBS, but it's like PBS in America is stifled because PBS should be doing things what the BBC is doing. The BBC is their public broadcaster, and they do these really. Everyone talks about these great like these BBC dramas and blah blah blah. It's like yeah, because they fund that and they do things that are really good about the culture. So they have, and the PBS has such a negative kind of education only here in America,
Yes.
But I say that because there's a lot of great stuff where the BBC does do these radio dramas. Like a bunch of stuff. Uh, shit. Well, fuck it. Mention his name now. A bunch of stuff that Neil Gaiman did was done as these radio plays.
Mm.
Like either stuff he wrote or either stuff that. But forever, Doctor Who, like almost everything. There's a version of it that's done as the radio. Because the
Yeah.
radio culture is so much bigger, I think, in England than
And I think it still is to an extent.
yeah,
Like I
yeah,
know I know people, English friends of mine, who still talk about listening to radio dramas today,
yeah.
which seems so anachronistic. I think in this country, it seems like people in this country literally would be like, "What's a radio play?" Because people in the last 30, 40 years haven't heard that in America.
Well, yeah, I mean, the closest thing to it, would be these, like the best narrative podcast that
Sure.
we see now is what they do in the BBC. Because
Yeah.
I've heard some of those recently, some of these BBC things, and they're really well done. But you're right, it's like the thing about this story is just the way he like this the banter between these two. They use a lot of kind of like some of the phonetics
Yes.
is like, oh, here's how a British person is gonna say something. Like the way they say, like terrific,
Yeah, that's what I was gonna
it's
say.
like
That's that one
it's
really stands
it's
out.
different, and it's like, oh, but it's weird because when you read it, it's like you gotta keep like reminding yourself that that's terrific. But if you
Yeah.
heard them say it on the radio play, then you know exactly what they were saying.
Yes.
And that's the cool thing about the radio stuff is that when you read this, like and I watched like a little bit of that BBC documentary, but it's like you hear the tremble in the wife's voice
Yes.
that you just can't get in your own head,
No, it's
and
true.
and
Yes.
it's also, and he didn't even write it that way where like like because sometimes comic guys when they want your voice to tremble, like the font is a little whatever,
Right.
like the lettering is trembly, like how they do that, but it's like he didn't do
Yeah.
that, which is whatever, not to take anything away from him, but it's like but that's what he didn't get. It's funny because at the top of the documentary he's so casual about it. He's like, yeah, whatever. This thing I wrote, like, but it made sense that he was like, oh yeah, he couldn't be invested in this too long for too long. He just
Yeah.
couldn't be.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's too much of his life.
It's a lot. Yeah. It's very horrific. And we should say, just talking a little bit about the comic book formally for anybody looking at the images in the video that we have accompanying this episode, it really does look very much like the format of like an old comic strip, from decades and decades ago. It's a lot of
From the
small,
paper, yeah.
yeah, yeah, from the newspaper. Right, right. And it's a lot of small tier panels where frankly not a lot is happening. It's just a very domestic scene between this couple as they're having increasingly sort of agonized discussions and then slowly building a bomb shelter. And you've got some occasional panels that are bigger or kind of like, looks like some bigger illustrations where they're talking about various world leaders, and you'll have a big page showing an illustration of Stalin or Roosevelt or Hitler or somebody. But for the most part, it's just this couple and their conversations looking like an old newspaper strip. But the one thing I want to point out formally that's really fascinating is how the rhythm of the story is broken up with all these incredibly dense little miniature panel pages, and then every 4 or 5 pages in the beginning you get a giant double page spread of
Yeah.
the nuclear bombs on their way to destroy the lives of this couple and everyone else. So it's like that's a really cool kind of audacious storytelling tactic here. And so you have all these pages of like banter, banter, banter between the couple, super small panels. And then you turn the page and it says, meanwhile, on a distant plain. And it's just 2 pages of like grayed out sky with one giant missile just off center on the left side. And then you go back to the couple, back to the couple, and then there's another double page spread. Meanwhile, in the distant sky, and we see the planes launching with the missiles. And then a couple pages later, meanwhile, in a distant ocean, and we see what we assume is a nuclear submarine.
Yeah.
Yeah, coming at us looking like a menacing giant shark or something. And then all of it culminates where the bomb finally does drop, and the gentleman is kind of losing his mind because the radio says the enemy missile attack has been launched against this country in just over 3 minutes. And suddenly, for the first time, he's quite rude to his wife. And he says, God almighty ducks, there's only 3 minutes to go. And she says, oh dear, I'll just get the washing in. And he says, come back, you stupid fool, and get in the shelter. Take cover. And she says, how dare you talk to me like that, James? Oh, and it's the radio saying, take cover, take cover. He says, shut up and get in. And she says, oh, there's no need to forget our manners just because there's a war on. And the radio says, do not leave your homes. And the guy screams at her. He says, shut up. I'm trying to listen. And the radio goes on, stay indoors, do not leave your homes, lie down. And she says, I've never heard such language in all my life. And he says, for God's sake, shut up. And he grabs her and he yanks her and pulls her into their little makeshift shelter. And she says, oh dear, I've left the oven on. And he yells, get in, get in, get in. And then she says, oh, the cake will be burned. It's so crazy. And then you turn the page and it's 2 pages of white.
Yeah.
It's 2 pages of white with just slight pink, red sort of speckling.
Yeah. It's like
it really.
And the next, and then there's the page. It's like stuff is exploding at the bottom, like
really awesome sort of storytelling. These giant white pages, double page spread, pink speckling. You turn the page again, and like you say, it's just sort of like distressed, like panels slowly coming into view, right? Slowly coming back.
Cool. It's cool because it's like when you see this in the video, it's like what the hell is this? But it's like that's their fallout shelter that has been distorted by the bomb. Not to say that it gets destroyed, but it's like that's like the radiation like is blasting through everything. It's a really cool technique, and then it finally kind of like calms down and comes back to. I mean, the way he did this, like it's like each page. Well, this has got more. Like each page has got 7 rows of
many panels.
So
many panels, like 1, 2, 3, 4.
It's like a 28, sometimes 28 panels on a page. Like that's a lot of fucking artwork you got to be doing.
Man.
It's very repetitive.
It really is.
I mean, it's crazy, but but he's not sloppy with any of it, which is really kind of. I mean, he's got like a kid's book style, but he's not sloppy with it. It doesn't feel like he. I mean, 18 months, Jesus Christ, that would just kill me. I guess he's drawing it and painting it. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Do, it is a lot, man. And that kid's book style hits really hard with this subject matter. It's like my old writing mentor used to always talk about this phrase that he called the unity of opposites. And he would talk about just how powerful it is as a storyteller when you can juxtapose these seemingly incongruous things for like a unique effect, right? So like kid's book style to illustrate nuclear devastation, like that I think is like a really powerful juxtaposition because you don't expect these things to go together. When you look at the drawing style, it looks really cute. And you don't expect the story to be so adult and horrific.
And to be so devastating. I mean, here's the thing that's interesting though about this, right? So like the way the wife behaved, the way they both behave, there's this, and she says this thing about like, there's no way to behave. It didn't act like it wasn't like this before, blah blah blah. It's like, one of the things is, so let's see, it's something that we don't have any really experience with in the US, is we don't have experience with war and like war on our soil. And I saw this movie recently called Blitz, the Steve McQueen movie.
Oh, right, right.
And it's about a kid, like a mixed race kid, like during the Blitz during in World War II in London. And the thing that they kind of do in this, and it reminds me of this really, really fascinating book called A Woman in Berlin. It's like a diary of a woman who wrote maybe a month, 6 weeks in the final days of World War II, like around the time when the Russians came into Berlin and everything like that. And it's a really devastating book in terms of what happened, like the rapes and the people selling themselves and the killings, everything. But the thing that both those things did that which is sort of weird, is there's this sense of trying to maintain order in the chaos. There's a sense of like I'm not like I still have dignity left in my life. I'm not gonna let the bombs and the war like totally turn me totally savage. I'm gonna,
Right.
it's a very kind of it's it's very interesting. I think the one time I saw this one time in a movie that made me kind of like where I was reminded of this was not right. But it pointed out to me. It was in that Wilder movie called Stalag 17, which was sort of
Oh,
like the
sure.
basis for Hogan's Heroes. But it's like you have these prisoners of war, and they're doing everything they can to kind of like live like they're not prisoners of war. Like they put on these like drag queen things, and the way, it's like they don't. It's such a I think there's a way not to have like a psychic break when this stuff happens, is that
Yeah.
you kind of have to hold on to what you do know, what you do remember as civilization. Because there's a really cool part later on, like in this, when they go outside and they're like, "Where's the paper? Where's the milkman? What the fuck is going on?" He's like, "He never did this." But then they see the ground, the asphalt, and they're like, "Oh, what happened
Right.
here? It looks all sticky. It looks all like it's been turned to mush from the heat and everything." And it's like, "Oh yeah, like that's what would fucking happen. Like the earth, like the infrastructure would be like just devastated." And he touches on it a little bit with like there's no water, there's no gas, there's no like TV, but it's like they're not trying to let themselves fall deep into the situation because they would go mad.
Yes.
I think that's kind of
Yeah.
like an interesting point about this.
Yeah. I mean, it's so horrific, and toward the very end, where the nuclear radiation is just ravaging their bodies, they're just still in complete denial. And they wake up with their bodies falling apart, and they're looking like it's actually really interesting the way the coloring has changed in these final pages, Chris.
Yeah,
If you look at like the very last 2 or 3 pages, they look so sickly, and it actually suddenly looks like the coloring of like kind of like a horror comic,
yeah,
or like it's like some, like you think you're suddenly reading something that really is intended to be highly disturbing, because it looks like it doesn't look like the bright cheery colors we started with. So it's
no,
very, yeah, very smart the way it's done. But they wake up looking like zombies, and they're in their little makeshift shelter. Actually, no, they've come out of the shelter, and they've been just kind of sleeping back in their house again, which is why their bodies are falling apart. They're being exposed to all of this fallout. And they wake up in the morning, and the guy says, "Ooh, I do fancy a nice cup of tea." And she says, "Do you think the cows will be affected by the bomb, dear?" "Oh, no, I shouldn't think so. They're all out in the country." "Supplies of milk will be maintained. It is essential for the maintenance of healthy bones and teeth." "Yes, but we live in the country, dear." "Yes, I know, dear." "Well, the grass is all dead and funny." "Yes, well, I don't know. I expect there may be a temporary curtainment of supplies." And that's something that's interesting too, is like he obviously means curtailment, but he says curtainment here. And there's a lot of times where like, yeah, he either misspeaks, or he's using like some, Britishism that I'm not familiar with, or he's just like they're phonetically sounding out his accent in a funny way. But there's a lot of these words where I'm like, is that supposed to be phonetic, or is he just supposed to be dim? because I'm not sure what that is sometimes. But
Well, see, that to me is where I was like, oh, again, so this is like if we heard them say this,
right.
I don't think we would really give it a
We wouldn't
second
think
thought.
that. Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm thinking it because I see it spelled that
Because you
way,
see,
and I'm just
because
right,
like if you look at the way if you look at the way he always writes governmental, he's like
right.
govern dash mental,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Totally, totally. And that's you're right. You're right. And
like
that's
very
clearly
much breaking up. And it's like
yes.
if you think about, I've had a few friends from the UK in my life, and sometimes depending on their social class, there's like they have these there's a dialect, and
Yeah.
it's like I always find it funny because you kind of pick up on these little these ways they say like words. I'm like, you do know that's one word, not two, kind of thing, you know.
Right. Right.
But it's an interesting thing. I mean, yeah, this page was devastating, and to me, the a few pages earlier, the part that was really shocking to me was when he says to her, "So do you have lipstick on, dear?" She's like, "You
Oh.
never put lipstick on forever." She's like, "It's my mouth is bleeding," and blah blah blah. And I was like,
Yeah, 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 right. No, no, it really is turning into like some horror movie shit. And this couple, and it's like body horror. Their bodies are falling apart, and then yeah, and then here, they're still being very casual. They're trying to hold on to that normalcy. And he says, "Oh, I'm gonna have to pop down to the chemist's in the morning." And she says, "Yes, we could do with some lozenges or pastilles too. I've still got a terrible throat." And meanwhile, they look like zombies. They're like at death's door. And so there is some very dark comedy here. And then she says, "I'm going to have an early night, James. We could do with a good long rest after that blessed bomb. Oh yes, it's bound to take it out of you. A thing like that, a shock to the system. Oh yes, it's bound to shake you up a bit." um, and then she says, "Ooh, look, my hair's coming out." And she looks very upset. And he says, "Don't worry, dearest. Women don't go bald. That's a scientific fact." And so then she just kind of moves on and she says, and this part I thought was very sad too. She says, "Shall we get back into those paper bags again?" "Whatever for, dear?" "Well, you never know. There might be another one, another bomb while we're asleep. I suppose it wouldn't hurt. It would be a sensible precautionary measure in the circumstances. After all, this is an all out war situation." And so then they literally crawl back into these paper bags, and they get into these bags, and the wife says, "Now you know what it feels like to be a potato. Ooh, it's stuffy in these bags." And then they lie down in these bags together, and they kind of shuffle into their little makeshift nuclear shelter.
Yeah,
And this is the last page of the book, is just they say goodnight to each other, and then we just hear their voices, and we don't see them over the final page. And one of them says, "Shall we pray, dear?" And the other says, "Pray. Yes. Crumbs. Who to? Well, God, of course." "Oh, I see. Yes, if you think it would be the correct thing. It can't do any harm, dear. Okay, here we go. Dear sir. No, that's wrong. How do you start? Oh, God. Our help in ages past. That's it. Keep it up. Almighty and most merciful Father." That's good. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered, unto thee. I shall fear no evil. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me all the days of my life. Lay me down in green pastures." I can't remember anymore. That was nice, dear. I liked the bit about the green pastures. "Oh, yes. Into the valley of the shadow of death." "Oh, oh, no more, love, no more." And then the final panel has one of them saying, "Rode the 600." And that left me kind of scratching my head at the end, because I assumed it was a reference to something that I should know. And
well,
so I
it's
looked it up. And did you catch that reference right away? Because I had to look it up.
I mean, it's something from the Bible, or is it something from Greek mythology?
No, no, it's actually a poem. It's a poem called "The Charge of the Light
Oh
Brigade."
yeah, okay, yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, and it was a poem by. Here we go. I actually I've got the poem here because it's interesting. Um, so it's by Lord Alfred Tennyson.
Yes.
Um, and this was a poem he wrote in response to a situation, a real life situation that had happened here. That was quite a famous thing, where a whole bunch of British soldiers basically rode off to their death and were slaughtered. And in that poem, famously, the beginning of the poem is half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death, rode the 600, forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death, rode the 600. And so it was about, this real life thing that happened, and it was a very famous poem, about people just riding off into certain death for their country. And I thought that was kind of a fascinating final note to end the story on here. Obviously, a very intentional final note there. And yeah, I mean, this is one of those stories that's quite short, but it would bear up to a whole lot of unpacking and analysis, because there's a lot here that's quite significant that could be pondered for a while.
Well, there's that. I mean, I think there's a lot more about the stuff he says here at the end, where he says I should feel no evil. The rod and the staff comfort me. Like all the like
Hmm.
that's another. It's like he's quoting. This whole page is him. He's quoting these kind of I don't want to say like they're eulogies, but they're also like eulogies. They are kind of like biblical verses. There are these famous things people said, at the moment of people dying,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
like that's what that is. Because I think the Charge of the Light Brigade was like written in response to something that happened in Afghanistan, or maybe it was the Crimean War.
It was the Crimean. You're right. You're right. It's the Crimean War, and it was about the author here. Tennyson is describing how 600 soldiers rode for 1.5 miles into certain death. They charged forward into gunfire. The Valley of Death is an allusion to this real event during the Crimean War. Most of the men were killed, causing an outcry in England because the order was given to them in error. And so the Valley of Death became a refrain and is a nod, like you say, is a nod to a passage in the Bible that states, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. These soldiers acted without fear, and so they bravely charged ahead, even though they were obeying an order that was given in error.
Well, it's interesting because that has such sway over England as a culture. If
Hmm.
you take the order that's wrong and you all go into death. I say that because that's sort of the main MacGuffin in that movie 1917.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the movie or not, but in that movie, these two boys, they're not boys, but they're young men. They're maybe in their 20s, early 20s. They are told you gotta cross fucking enemy lines, do all this cool shit in the movie with the fucking single take thing, blah blah blah, because because you have to get to the front line because they're about to get a called in and to charge and go over the trench to attack the Germans, and it's all a trap. And it's like, oh, it's like they're all being sent to death, and they have the wrong order because they can't communicate. The lines have been cut. So it's a very similar thing as the thing in the Crimea. It's like, but it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
you see, that's the thing's interesting. That's the thing's interesting about. I don't know if I said this before on the podcast and this thing, but and it's interesting this on BBC because the one thing that I know that like the French do and the British do is a lot of their television and movies is these things that explore the cultural power and legacy of their nation and of their culture, which is why you see a lot
Mm.
of these things like how many times have we seen some version of Sherlock Holmes that's come out of England? How many times have we seen the story about the kings, the story about the war, like whatever it is, like the movie The Blitz? I mean, we've seen there's a lot of British movies about the Blitz, but it's like they keep venerating
Yeah.
their stories, their culture, it's like the whole King Arthur thing. We're gonna see that like 9 times. It's interesting because in America, we don't like to do that. Like, there's one version and that's it. No more. We don't need to do any more. And, yeah, but it's I think it's part of why a lot of times, like I said, like the BBC's, their public broadcasting, like, it's the same thing in France. Like, how many times are you gonna see like, but it's not that it's a bad thing because there was a version of the Count of Monte Cristo that just came out last year that I
Oh,
saw
yeah. I heard it was
December,
amazing.
which was probably the best movie I saw in the last 2
Yeah,
years.
yeah, yeah. That's what I heard from other people
And
too. I hear
it's
it was
so
phenomenal.
fucking
Yeah.
good. And it's like
Wow.
and it's weird because it's like that was one of the first like long novels that I ever read. I was like a fifth or sixth grade or something like that, and I love that story. I love that thing of the revenge of people doing you
Yeah.
wrong because it's such a story. It's a parable that we all can understand in life in a way that you
Yeah.
might not know when you first read it. And then everyone over here, like, fell in love with that one with Jim Caviezel and Guy Pearce from, like, 2002 or something like 2005. But it's like, so I'm watching this one and I'm like, the way it begins is different. It's just like, "Oh, this is all different now." Like, every moment they took a time to, and it's not a different story, but the way that they get into the story, the way that they, like, navigate the story and get you to points that you do remember that are the key points are much, much different. And it's not like,
Mm.
"What are you doing? Like, you're sacrilegious." And it's like, "No, this is a way that it could also happen." And they also
Mm.
did something really fascinating in like in that movie, which I don't think I've seen in a long time, if ever, in a movie set in that time period. They did one of those things that like Soderbergh did in like Ocean's 11, when they're talking about the crime, as it's happening, like they're in a basement planning it, and then you see it happening, but it's going wrong. That little that flash forward of heist movies they do, like it's a
Mm.
heist movie trope, but they're doing it in this kind of Monte Cristo thing. And I was like, I didn't know that. I mean, I don't. That's like a cool way to do that, and he's doing something a little different in there. So it's an interesting thing that this is from the Charge of the Light Brigade because it's again that's going to have a lot more meaning to people in England, particularly then that final
Yes.
line, because people were just more literate about
Oh,
their
yeah, totally.
history, like in '82 than what they are now, and just more understanding of like their historic culture. So that kind of like is very strong.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
very strong way to end this. Very, very
Oh,
strong way
totally.
to end this.
I would
Um,
agree. I would agree, man, because just sort of like building on what you're saying too there, I'm reading this whole poem for the Charge of the Light Brigade, and that line, rode the 600, into the valley of death, rode the 600, is the final refrain of every single stanza. So it's like you hear that, rode the 600 over and over again. And the second stanza here, just kind of speaking again to what we're talking about, the second stanza in terms of this legacy of following orders regardless of whether they're correct or not. The second stanza starts by saying, "Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why,
yeah,
theirs but to do and die.
yeah,
Into
that's
the
very
valley of
famous.
death." Yeah, into the valley of death rode the 600. And then the next couple lines are powerful too. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left, cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600.
See
So
see that
very
line.
powerful.
Yeah, very
It's
powerful.
amazing.
That line, "Ours not to wonder why, ours is but to do or die." Like, I remember hearing that as a kid, and I
Mm.
didn't know where it was from until a lot of times. Because it's an interesting rhyme structure, until I read this poem. It's funny, the Crimean War, it's in the news now because that's the thing with Ukraine, and Russia sees that in the thing, and I always try to remember how, like, I don't know how England and France were fighting in the Crimea, and it's like, it's funny, the first place I heard about that was in, the Michael Crichton movie, The Great Train Robbery,
Oh, wow.
because in that movie, they're gonna steal gold that is used to pay the soldiers who are fighting in the Crimean War. It's like it's that's I love that movie. That's like a really fucking good movie. It's like with Donald Sutherland and Sean Connery and Leslie Ann
Oh, Donald
Down.
Sutherland was in that too? That's
Yeah,
funny. We were just talking about Don't Look Back before
yeah,
we
we were,
recorded
yeah,
here
yeah,
today.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
wow, that's
yeah.
funny. Sutherland, man. Sutherland was in
He was
everything.
in a lot of shit.
Yeah,
Like
Jesus.
he was like the for about from the I'd say in the '70s, '80s, and early '90s, he was like the Sam Jackson. Like if he was in
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
movie,
He was
he's
in
showing up in a
a
lot of
lot
shit.
of good
I
stuff,
mean, he
man.
still does a lot of stuff too. But
Lot of
like
good stuff.
once he got a little older, he couldn't be in as many movies, but because he's an older man and he can't he's not as versatile. But yeah, it's like, yeah, this is like the power of this book, the power of like the storytelling and what he was wanting to do. And it's funny to look at these last panels again. It's like you see this very stark, like like the shelter at 60 degrees. It's funny how he makes that. He makes such a big deal about that. He's like, it's 60 degrees. You have to get the protractor
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I was like, what is this? What are you talking about?
Yeah, it's all these really hilarious details that he's getting from the government pamphlet. You got to get a protractor. You got to get the steel at this
This
angle,
angle
etc.
is gotta be 60
Yeah,
degrees, and he's like, and he goes to the store, and the guy's like, "There are no more protractors, ha, ha, ha," and he's like, "What the hell?" But the guy showed me how to do it. He gave me a piece. I was like, "This is so
yeah.
bizarre." Like, they don't quite.
It's so sad, and like the mundane aspects of what he's trying to exert control over in the face of a nuclear holocaust is like really, it's really poignant and really sad. And I'm just noticing, by the way, the animated version of this, which I would also be curious to check out, apparently had a title song done by David Bowie. So Bowie did the title song for this. I did not realize that. And the score for the animated film was done by Roger Waters.
From
So
Pink Floyd?
from Pink
Jesus.
Floyd, yeah, Pink Floyd. Roger Waters from Pink Floyd did the score, and David Bowie did the title song. So yeah, that's pretty phenomenal. It looks like that was in '86, so maybe a few years after the comic. You had the animated film. You had, obviously the play version we referred to. So yeah, this was a story that was overwhelmingly seen and heard across various media and mediums throughout the '80s, and I think it's really a signature work. And I believe I read also in doing research for this here that Raymond Briggs, I believe, was the first inductee into the UK Comic Book Hall of Fame, or the Cartoonist Hall of Fame, or some such thing, that he was literally the first cartoonist inducted. And that's what a significant figure he was. And certainly When the Wind Blows is one of his signature works, arguably his most acclaimed, but he's got several works that were actually quite acclaimed. So I don't know that I can say that authoritatively, but it's certainly one of his signature works.
Well, I mean,
And you can see why.
yeah, but also it's like you said earlier, it's like he's known for doing children's work,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's like all of a sudden see, this is interesting because you really gotta gamble. You have to really use your creative currency to gamble to do a work like this, and then
Hmm.
it's gotta hit.
Oh,
Like, it
yeah.
can't be,
Yeah, it's true.
like, I mean, like, it can't even just be like a B minus, you know?
No, no, it's got to be
It's gotta be
great.
A plus, and
Yeah.
everyone's gotta, like, be, like, shocked because it's like there's a story, like, there's a movie, I don't remember what it's called now. There's a movie that Wes Craven did that is like a straight up school drama. Like,
Hmm.
It's not Mr. Holland's Opus, but it's something like Mr. Holland's Opus.
Really? Wow,
It's
I didn't
like
know
a
he did something like that. Wow.
yeah, but it didn't do well, you know?
Okay, that's why. Okay.
And, I think, like, Mary McDonnell's in it. I mean, um but the thing is, it's a good movie. It's not a great movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then he never got a chance to do anything else like that again, and then he, like, obviously died. But I think the only reason why he went back and did like that, like, he did some more horror movies was because that movie failed, and he was, like, trying to get out of horror, or at least
Right.
just open up an opportunity to do stuff, because you look at his career, and it's like he did like a couple movies in like the '70s that I think, like, um last House on the Left or something like that. I can't remember what his first movie was. But he was one of those guys, like, who's like a contemporary of Spielberg and Coppola and Scorsese. In terms of
Hmm.
his career kind of took off right before Spielberg's did. I mean, obviously a little older, but he couldn't get out of horror.
Hmm.
And he got
Right.
stuck in that, and where Spielberg was, like, lucky. I mean, it would not, I mean, like, those horror movies that he did, that Craven did, they made a lot of money, obviously. They didn't make, like,
Yeah.
Jaws money, but, like the thing I was saying in that I think people kind of forget this about Spielberg. They don't realize that he had a reputation of always going over schedule, always going over budget. Unlike on Jaws, on Close Encounters, and it bit him in the ass on 1941 because that movie then flopped. So he was sort of in like director's probation. Is on his way to director's jail when he did Raiders, which saved him.
Right.
But it's like but I don't know what movie. I think Wes Craven. I don't know why I'm just saying in my head, but maybe it's the horror in this. But it's like it's hard to jump out of your like what you're known for, and so
Right.
for this guy to get into the cartoonist Hall of Fame, it had to have been not just for one work. It had to be for his whole body of work. And this is sort of like an outlier in terms of like his content, but probably not his like the impact. Because if he could write something that this impactful for adults, as obviously if he's mainly doing children's stuff, he could talk to them in a way too that's probably really potent.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And speaking on that, like that change in his career from doing children's stuff to adult stuff, I have this interview in front of me here that Raymond Briggs did shortly before he passed away with Paul Gravett for the Comics Journal. And in this interview from just a few years ago, because Mr. Briggs just passed away recently, he says here when the interviewer asks him. About When the Wind Blows, he says, that was the book that really turned your reputation around. Previous to that, you'd been purely a children's book illustrator. Was it hard to persuade your publishers to let you tackle this much darker subject matter? And Raymond Briggs says, no, I don't remember any resistance to it. and then Gravett responds, but the book did stir up some controversy and was even discussed in Parliament. And Briggs says, yes, they sent copies to all the House of Commons, House of Lords as well. There must have been some outrage. Lady Olga Maitland was incensed and said it was CND propaganda. There were demonstrations outside the Whitehall Theater 50 yards from Downing Street when I did a play of it as well. They'd either hired or their headquarters happened to be opposite, I don't know, but they hung banners, bunting, Union Jack flags, and loudspeakers playing Land of Hope and Glory. I was heavily involved with the play. I wrote the thing. They did the production extremely well. The explosion and the collapse of the house were superbly done, laser lights and everything. But there was no development, just these two people wandering around the stage, dying, and then they die. So there's no other conflict as such. Um, and and so then he goes on and he talks a little bit more about it.
Oh,
And
hold
yeah.
on. On the version I'm reading, it's quotes from some people from members of Parliament.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Do you want to read any of those?
Yeah. There's someone named David Steele says, very original and clever. Unnerving though it is, though. And then there's some guy named Eric Hefner says, extremely effective and timely.
Hmm.
And in one word, it was chilling. But it also says what the House said. So I'm thinking the House is the House of Lords, not the.
Hmm.
And this guy named Hansard says, this House welcomes the publication of When the Wind Blows by Raymond Briggs as a powerful contribution to the growing opposition to nuclear armament and hopes that it will be widely read.
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, the book clearly made an impact, was being talked about in Parliament, and got adapted every which way. So, I mean, for Raymond Briggs transitioning from kids' books to a much more chilling adult story, yeah, he could not have done something more impactful that I could imagine. This is a story that's, I think, has never gone out of print. And since it was published in 82, it likely never will go out of print. It is an evergreen classic in the world of UK comics and cartooning. And one final note that I'd like to mention is just in a kind of charming but kind of spooky touch, the main couple here is actually based on Raymond Briggs's real life parents. And he did one previous comic that was also about them, right? I think right before this. And I think that was called Gentleman Jim. And it was also about the blogs couple, Jim and his wife here. And then here again, he returns to their story, and they were inspired by his real life mom and dad. And I think that's really interesting. His father Ernest and his mother Ethel, and and he actually ended up ultimately doing another comic as well, where he ultimately did their true story later, which was called Ethel and Ernest: A True Story, where I think it was no longer just characters that were modeled after his parents. And here they touch on that also in the journal interview. They say, your parents have been the models or inspirations for several of your books. But then in 1998, you did Ethel and Ernest, and you told their own story. And then he goes on to talk about that, and he says, "Yeah, I did." And they were a perfectly ordinary couple. My father was a milkman. My mother worked as a lady's maid. And after they married as an office clerk, they lived in the same terraced house in Wimbledon Park in South London for 40 years. They never once went abroad. Only after they retired did they go to the Channel Islands once, and they were completely amazed. So a perfectly ordinary working class couple, and he devoted a good amount of his life to just kind of chronicling stories about them or characters like them. And that's kind of a fascinating way for him to sort of spend his artistic life. And in a way, he's documenting just the ordinary lives of ordinary people that he knew really well, and almost in a cartooning as archaeology kind of a sense. This will be a great record of how people lived, in England at a certain time in history, hundreds of years from now, thousands of years from now. When people look back on the work of Raymond Briggs, they're going to get a pretty good idea of sort of the mind state and the day-to-day life of a certain type of couple in this part of the world. And I think there's something really valuable there too. It's a really interesting and worthwhile way. I think he spent his cartooning career, and very unique. So I have not read the rest of Raymond Briggs's work, but after reading When the Wind Blows, I'm definitely curious to check out some of his other books. So yeah, that's all I got to say. But I think this was a hell of a compelling short piece, and I'm glad we looked at it.
I'm glad we looked at it too. I'll just say this last thing. Now that you saying that, how he's doing this about his parents and the way they're living, and it's like it reminds me. It's like he's doing a cartoon version of those British kitchen sink drama movies
Yes,
from the 60s that
totally.
which are interesting because it's like they have such like very, which they would say today in Hollywood, they have like the lowest of stakes, you know? But
Yeah.
but they were these like kind of explorations of the lower class or the working class that was not necessarily part of the English filmmaking tradition, definitely not part of the Hollywood tradition. Um, and I think that's what makes this again. I think that's what makes this book so charming. And you're right. I'd be curious to read the thing about his parents at least. You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Um, so I guess that's it for this week's episode of Comics Rot Your Brain.
Yep.
And we'll be back hopefully next week with another episode for y'all.
Yes, and thank you all so much for listening. If you made it this far, for God's sake, please hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be back very soon with more obscure, or sometimes not so obscure, comics from the 80s that we think deserve a little examining and whatnot. So yeah, folks, thanks for listening, everybody. And also, don't forget, we got a Patreon that we would love for everyone to please check out. Big things happening very soon this year with the CRYB Patreon.